life has proximal meanings, right? There's the meaning that you experience when you're engaged in a piece of art, or when you're reading, or when you're engrossed in a movie or in a conversation. There's the meaning that emerges within your relationships with people that you cherish or are enthusiastic with. There's meanings of security and predictability. There's meanings of duty and responsibility and active engagement with your job and your career. There's meanings of aesthetic pleasure. Now, all of those have their value, and each of them has their place. And maybe there's a hierarchy of value there as well, so that some of those meanings are deeper than others. And then you might say, well, what characterized the deepest of all meanings? And it would be something like relationship with the transcendent, and that would establish a relationship between you and what's always been conceptualized as God, which is generally supposed to be something ineffable, right? It's not definable, but you might think about it as the central animating spirit of the age, or the value around which all other values are organized, or the wisdom of the ages, or the creative spirit that possesses you when you're inspired, or what grips you with enthusiasm at a sports event or at a musical event. All of those things. And we need a relationship with that. And we find our deepest meaning in that relationship. And if we don't find it, I think if we don't find it in something that's explicitly religious, then we tend to magnify something of lesser value, say something political, into that to fill the void. So yes, life has proximal meanings without God, without eternity, but at the ultimate level, something's lacking. And it's the desire to fulfill that lack that, and maybe the lack itself, that's part and parcel of the religious instinct. So you can kill God, but you can't. That doesn't rectify the hunger for God. And then that hunger seeks out replacements. That's how it looks to me. So, and then, you might also say, well, does that mean you have to believe in God? And I don't think of the proper answer to that is that you need to agree with a propositional statement. Does God exist? Yes. Like, is this table there? Yes. It's not that kind of relationship. I mean, it's characterized in the Old Testament as a struggle. So Israel means those who struggle with God. And you have to participate in that struggle. And you can do that, weirdly enough, as a believer or as a non-believer. Maybe sometimes more intensely as a non-believer. The issue might be more paramount then, the issue of virtue and the issue of the ultimate orientation. If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You'll get through it, and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got. Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. I've got a good job. I've got a good family. My wife loves me. But man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable. I'm suffering. I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so. But other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job? Or how about a career, or failing that, a job? It's like, well, I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and I'm that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life, and you can find out if they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life. Multidimensionally. Like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony in some real sense of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. Now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner
you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do, and so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children. Let's say you need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? You have to be, they have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that's just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure, you know, regardless of its scope? And the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal.
Does consciousness die with the body, and is meaning doomed like the universe?
Well, I don't know, I would say. I mean, we don't understand consciousness. We don't really understand its place in the cosmos, let's say, but I'm not qualified to answer such questions. I would say, though, that no one stops listening to a symphony because they know it's going to end. And so I think, in some sense, our proper task is to find the meaning within the finite. When I had clinical clients who were consumed with such questions, because, you can pick a time frame of evaluation that makes all your efforts futile, right? So, well, the sun is going to envelop the earth. I think it's 4 billion years, so, get ready. It's like, well, what's the point of stopping this baby from crying when the sun is going to envelop the earth in 4? Well, yeah, you all laugh, right? But that laughter, you see, that's a sign of wisdom. That's preposterous. Well, why? I mean, that's the existential question, right? It's like, well, if we're all doomed to ashes and decay, why do anything? Well, I used the baby crying for a reason. I mean, who in the world is going to use that argument to not feed their baby? Well, why feed that thing? In 4 billion years, the sun's going to envelop the earth. It's like, wrong time frame, folks. And so what I would say, and I did say to my clinical clients, if you're adopting a time frame that makes what you're doing appear trivial, the problem isn't necessarily what you're doing, although it might be, and you have to ask yourself that question because perhaps you are engaging in something that's more trivial than you should be. The problem is that your mind, which is capable of leaping across evaluative frameworks, has picked a time frame inappropriate for the task. So quit doing that. Instead, you could say, well, why don't you practice adopting the time frame that imbues your properly oriented action with the deepest possible apprehended meaning? And why would you not think that the fact that that meaning manifests itself with the proper choice of time frame, why wouldn't you accept the fact that's indication of a valid choice? It certainly feels like it. You know what it's like. You get engaged in something, a deep conversation, a piece of music, a piece of art, something you love doing, someone you love being with. You get engaged in that. You lose your sense of temporality. And you don't pop out of it and think, oh my God, I wish I would have used a time frame that made everything irrelevant because of my, cognitive brilliance. You think, hey, we could do that some more. Like, how about all the time? And that's a good goal. It's like, yeah, how about that all the time? And then you've got time right when you're engaged like that. And I would say that's a profound neurophysiological signal that you're in the right place at the right time, right? Because it's accompanied by a sense of deep well-being, and that's literally an antidote to suffering. I mean that literally. It's with many of my clients who were suffering, what we would strive to do was not so much make them happy, because sometimes that was impossible. They were so crippled in so many ways, often physically and in pain, but something meaningful. I would keep them going and keep them from straying and keep them from thinking homicidal and genocidal thoughts, all of that. And meaning, that's the antidote to suffering. And the question is, well, how is that best to be found? Well, that's an empirical question. You have to look in your own life and see where meaning glimmers and then pursue that, right? That's what Harry Potter is doing, by the way, when he's chasing the snitch. Just thought I'd let you know. And you win the game if you catch that thing. So, well, that's not exactly right. You get 100 points, but, it'll do. So, another question? How about you?
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. You talked a lot about meaning, both from perception and in music and art. What do you mean by meaning? What is meaning, and where is its source?
Meaning is implication for action or for reorganization of the perceptual frames that frame action. So there.
Is and
Yeah.
and is that the sole aim of what you find in art and music?
Yes, in complex ways. I mean, in music, you find this demand that the music lays upon you to orient yourself in relationship to this harmonious interplay of patterns. And you might say, well, why is that meaningful? Well, that's a good question. Well, it's because you're acting out something like the adaptation of your soul to the structures of reality itself. Now, it's done very abstractly because the patterns of music are not precisely the actual patterns of the world, right? They're abstractions. But it's play and representation, and it's art. And so you're acting out the process of optimal adaptation at a very high level. When you think what people are doing, imagine a Viennese waltz, you know? So you have this unbelievably well-trained orchestra. They're all emitting patterns like mad, and they're playing while they're doing that, putting little twists on the patterns so that they're a little novel, a little interesting, even if you've heard the music many times. You have the conductor who's keeping all these specialized subsections operating in harmony, and then you have the couples dancing, and they're trained to do that, but they're cutting the rug, you know, in the same way. They have their moves, and they're trying to impress each other, and there's a mating aspect of that, and they're all doing that harmoniously, and it's a complete vision of a ordered society, right from the subatomic realm, let's say, all the way up to the cosmic realm. That's all taking place in the dance, and people don't know that, but well, they do know it too, you know, and they know it in that they're acting it out. And there isn't anything, in some sense, that you know more deeply or believe more deeply than that which you act out. And you're not smart enough to understand the full totality of your actions. I mean, we're not transparent to ourselves. We act out all sorts of things that are stunningly brilliant without realizing it. And it takes, in some sense, it takes often untold centuries for us to figure out what we were doing and why. And so that happens to you, you know, in your own life when you have a flash of insight into your own behavior. That's why I was doing that. It's like, well, you were doing it. Why didn't you know? Well, you're complicated. You're really complicated and certainly not transparent to yourself. And so I have a paper called 3 Types of Meaning. You could look that up if you wanted a more technical answer, but the music answer by example is a good one. And I think people can really relate to it because, you know, the only person you ever hear who says, well, I don't really like music is like, no, that's just a posture, you know. You like music. You just want to be, you know, kind of interestingly different and controversial. And it's really something, right? And it's also interesting that music has this non-propositional structure that's completely opaque to rational argumentation. You know, I used to like to watch punk rockers, yeah, especially the ones who did mosh pit punk rock. And, you know, I went to a Ramones concert once. It was quite comical. I was on the 2nd floor. It was so loud. I couldn't hear for 3 days after this concert because it was a pretty little theater. We sat about 800 people, and they had their stadium speakers in there. It was like sonic wall of sound. And we were above this mosh pit, and there was all these like nihilistic punk rockers down there smashing into each other and throwing themselves off the stage. And I thought, for all this talk of nihilism, there you are dancing to the harmonious patterns of life. It's like, you know, smash the state and all of that. It's like, we'll groove to that. Yeah, it's very comical. So even among the most propositionally nihilistic, they still fall in love with music.
I got together with the woman who was going to become my wife, Tammy. I mean, I've known her since we were 8, and she was a friend of mine when I was a kid, and so we've known each other forever. But we got together seriously when we were in our late 20s, and she was really ready to have a family, like now. And I didn't have a permanent job at that point, although my prospects were good, which is part of the reason she married me. But she wanted to start, and I thought, okay, so I didn't really want to do that. And I thought, okay, what's your problem, Jordan? What is it that you're worried about? And I thought, well, there's an economic issue. that's not really serious. I'll get a job, and she'll come along wherever I go if I have that job. So that's not an issue. It's like, so what then? Well, babies. What the hell do I know about babies? Nothing. I can't take care of a baby. I don't know how to do that. So I said to her, well, the reason I seem to be objecting is because I'm kind of doubtful about the infant stage. Like toddlers, I know what to do with them. I can play with kids, but when they're under a year, they're like a foreign object to me in many ways. I don't know what to do, and so that worries me. And so I'll tell you what, if you'll take primary care for the infant, I'll take care of you and the infant. And how would that be? And I think that's the right role. I really do believe that. And you might think, well, that's sexist. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. How are you so sure that that first year as a mother isn't one of the great parts of the fundamental adventure of being female? Like, so don't give me any crap about that being sexist. That's just, I don't think so. You know, and so what I would do is watch my wife, and if she got tired, spell her off. And I did what I could to take care of the infant, but I knew that, you know, she would take care of that while I stumbled around trying to learn how. And she did that. And that worked fine. And then, you know, as the kids got older, I took more and more responsibility for them. And when my daughter was about 2.5, I think that's right, 1.5, we had our second child. And then I took care of Michaela, the older child, quite a lot after that, because Tammy, of course, was busy, especially that first year with the infant, with Julian. But that worked well. That was a good division of labor as far as I was concerned. And also my wife was very happy about that because she loved to take care of infants. And that's characteristic of a lot of women, you know, and even those that don't admit it. And it's too bad they don't admit it, because what, there's something wrong with that? Is there some? I saw this tweet the other day about this grandmother, mother of a mature daughter, and the daughter had announced that she was never going to have kids, and her mother said, "Oh, I think that's just great. You know, you're gonna just live for you, and that's just wonderful. And I'm glad you can be so independent." And I thought, how could you possibly say something that stupid to your daughter? It's like, you don't want grandchildren, and you're so sure that she's just not ideologically addled about the fundamental realities and beauties and depth of life. It's like, how many things do? We have a career if we're lucky, or a job if we don't. If we're not, we have an intimate relationship, we have a family. That's life, man. You miss one of those, well, you can do it, but it's a big deal not to do that. What's my advice to young men seeking a woman for marriage and family? Yeah. Well, okay, fine. That's the same second question. That's pretty straightforward, man. I mean, you can't eliminate the necessity of being attracted to one another. That's important, and that's mysterious, you know. So, for example, here's a funny thing. One of the things we know that attracts people to one another is bilateral symmetry. And so if you take men and you rank them by the symmetry of their faces, and then you give the asymmetrical men t-shirts to wear, clean t-shirts for a day, and the symmetrical men clean t-shirts to wear for a day, and then you give the t-shirts to women and you have them rate the odor. The women rate the odor of the symmetrical men as more attractive than the odor of the asymmetrical men. And there are other factors that determine sexual attractiveness that are based on biological factors that are that deeply embedded, in terms of smell, for example. So women also tend to not be sexually attracted to the scent of men who have, if I remember correctly, it's Rh factors that would make for potential trouble in childbirth. And often the reason that the women give for not preferring the scent of those men is that they smell too much like their brother, something like that. So there's weird, mysterious things that determine whether or not people are sexually and physically attracted to each other, and I think it's very important that that's part of a marital relationship. The next most important thing is trust, man. It's like there's no marriage that's successful without trust. You've got to tell each other the truth. And one of the reasons that Jung believed that marriage and an oath, and Carl Jung, as a bond was necessary, it's really wise. It's like, you know, telling the truth to someone is no simple thing, because there's a bunch of things about all of us that are terrible and weak and reprehensible and shameful and all of those things, and they kind of have to be brought out into the open and dealt with. And you're not going to tell the truth about yourself to someone who can run away screaming when you reveal who you are. And so the marriage bond is something like, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to handcuff myself to you, and you're going to handcuff yourself to me. And then we're going to tell each other the truth, and neither of us are going to get to run away. And so once we know the truth, then we're either going to live together in mutual torment, or we're going to try to deal with that truth and straighten ourselves out jointly. And that's going to make us more powerful and more resilient and more and deeper and wiser as we progress together through life. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because if you leave a back door open, man, you're going to use it, that's for sure. And the oath is there. And this was Jung's commentary on the spiritualization of the human pair bond by Christian marriage, for example, which emphasized the what would you call it, the subordination of both members of the marital union to a higher order personality that was embodied in the figure of the logos. So the idea is that in the Christian marriage, for example, the man isn't the boss and the woman isn't the boss. The boss is the mutual personality composed by the seeking of truth in both of them, and that's conceptualized as their joint subjugation to the logos. And that is absolutely dead on, man. It's like the ruler of your marital life should be your vow to tell each other the truth. Like in hard times during your life, when you've done something stupid and idiotic that might take you down, and you don't have anybody that you can turn to, if you have a partner that you can trust, you can go say, hey, I made a big financial mistake, man, and it's really torturing me, and I feel like a complete idiot, and it's really dangerous. And the person there is going to help you figure out what to do about it. And they're going to know that when they make a stupid mistake, and they're bloody well going to, that they can come and talk to you, and that you guys are going to work your way through it. And that's a big deal. And there's a couple of things our culture gets really wrong, and one is it devalues marriage. That's really a very bad idea, because marriage is like a third of your life, and maybe more. And kids are a third of your life, and your life outside of marriage and kids is a third of your life, approximately speaking. And to miss any of that is a massive, massive mistake. Now, having said that, I will also say that for some people, missing one or more of those is necessary, because they have a reason. Maybe they're brilliantly creative artists and they need to devote themselves entirely to their career, or they're outstanding in some way, and so they can justify the sacrifice of one part of that triad of being to another part. But generally speaking, it's a very dangerous thing, and it shouldn't be done. And also, kids get an absolutely terrible rap, because kids are delightful if they're well behaved. One of the chapters in my new book is called Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And you can do that, especially if you discuss it thoroughly with your spouse, the person that's helping you discipline the kids. And children are the best company, because they're really enthusiastic about everything. They love doing new things. They really love you, so they're happy that you're around. All you have to do is make sure they're not too hot and they're not too cold, and they've had something to eat and they're not too tired, and you don't expect them to stay engaged in something for longer than they can manage. Because we used to take our kids when they were little out to restaurants, for example, and they could sit there no problem and behave really nicely when they were 2 and 3, but they couldn't do it for more than about 45 minutes. You can't push your luck. But I also noticed with little kids is that they got antsy and unreasonable about 5 to 10 minutes before the adults did too. It's just the adults were too stupid to notice. The kids would notice right away. So back to marriage. Well, you look for someone that you're attracted to, that you love, and then you look for someone that you can bloody well trust. And then you tell them the truth. And that way maybe you can get through life, and you can have someone to weave the rope of your being with, and together to make your joint rope stronger, and you can have some continuity in your narrative, and you can have children, and then you can have grandchildren, and like you can have a life, man. And there's nothing. You're so fortunate if you can manage that. And so, okay, so there's that one. So what's my advice to young men seeking a woman for marriage and family? Yeah, well, and also, Marry someone you think would be a good mother and that has enough sense, generally speaking, to know that she wants children. Now, some women don't want children, and fair enough. And some women perhaps shouldn't have children. That's also possible. But the general rule of thumb is, especially once a woman's, in her mid-20s, if she doesn't know that she wants children or won't admit it, unless she has a viciously important reason, then she's not oriented properly psychologically. She doesn't know what's important in life. Now, that might also be the case with you, and it probably is, but as a rule of thumb, that's a really good one.
If you're going to be a fighter, you have to want to win. And you have to want to hurt people. I mean, not for the sake of hurting them. That's what makes you different than an evil person. But you have to have that capacity. You have to develop that. And, that's the step on the way to enlightenment, weirdly enough, because that isn't what people think.
People have been fed this diet of pablum, rights and impulsive freedom for so long. There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story. And it's a hole that's in people's hearts, essentially. Because responsibility, well, perhaps that's not more important than rights. Like I said, they're part and parcel of the same formula. But it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not in impulsive pleasure. Those things blow away at the first ill wind. But to adopt the responsibility for your own well-being and to try to put your family together and to try to serve your community and to try to seek for eternal truths and to live them, that's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life. And when you tell people that, especially when you include yourself in the audience, let's say, and you're not finger waving from above, then everyone knows that it's true. There's been this attempt to identify masculine competence and power, let's say, but mostly competence with tyranny, and that's very, very hard on young men. It's also hard on young women, for that matter, but it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world, because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak. And life is a very difficult process, and you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order, right? And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea, because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous. You don't treat adult men as if they're infants.
If you don't know what you should do with your life, you don't know who you should be, sometimes you think about that as what career you should pursue. But here's another way of thinking about it. It's kind of a SEAL's ethos that Congressman Crenshaw detailed out. Here's some things you could be. Those are my words. These are his. You'll be someone who's never late. You will be someone who takes care of his men, gets to know them, and puts their needs before yours. You will be someone who does not quit in the face of adversity. You will be someone who takes charge and leads when no one else will. You will be detail-oriented, which you discuss a lot in later sections of the book, always vigilant, attentive. You will be aggressive in your actions, but never lose your cool. You will have a sense of humor, because sometimes that is all that can get you through the darkest hours. You will work hard and perform, even when no one is watching. You'll be creative and think outside the box, even if it gets you in trouble. You're a rebel, but not a mutineer. You are a jack of all trades and master of none. And then you follow that a little later with this paragraph. these paragraphs. Be aggressive enough to kill the enemy, but immediately calm enough not to scare the little old lady. You'll be that man who's mentally tough enough to operate in horrific chaos, then immediately transition to tranquility, all without mentally breaking. You will effectively transition from hyper-masculine aggressor to gentle caretaker. You'll be both a warrior and a gentleman. The qualities that made SEAL leaders great were rarely physical in nature. They listened. They empowered their team to be successful, carefully entrusting individuals with additional responsibility. It's a real conservative ethos there. They highlighted good performance publicly and criticized bad performance privately. And so, well, you know, those are lists of virtues, and maybe they're not the only list of possible virtues, probably not, but if you're lost and you don't know where to start, practicing, you know, you also talk about this idea that, this is an Aristotelian idea, you know, that we are our habits, we become what we practice, and imagine if you're lost and you're listening, you think, well, you find some things admirable. Well, you could practice those things, and you can practice them locally and minimally in your own relationships, and you can start to get good at them. And as you get good at them, well, you get better at them, right? And then you can broaden out the scope of your action into a wider purview. So you said here too, let's go for another quote here. Throughout your life, this is very practical advice too, and I think it's very wise from a therapeutic perspective. Throughout your life, you have people you look up to. Okay, so let's think about that. You look up. What does that mean? Why up? Well, up is something that beckons from a distance. It's like a light on a hill, and we automatically assume that those who we admire are people we look up to. So that specifies a distance and a direction, and it's uphill. It's up toward a higher vista, let's say. So there are automatically people who elicit that spirit in you. You have noticed the way.
It might also imply that there's some sense of struggle required to get to that point, because it's easier to go downhill than it is uphill.
Yes, definitely. That's right. It's an uphill trek. And it also implies judgment, because if someone's above you, then they also serve as a judge, or you serve as a judge in relationship to them, because you compare yourself unfavorably with them. And that can also inspire you to tear them down. That's really the story of Cain and Abel, and that's a major story. You have noticed the way a teacher, parent, coworker, mentor, or friend interacts with others, and you come away thinking, that behavior simply works better. They are respected, admired, and successful. And you find yourself wondering why that is. You do if you're a little bit humble instead of being envious, right? Because otherwise you think, well, that damn crook, he just stole his position, and that's why he's got it. But if you're a bit humble, you might think, well, no, that guy looks successful. Maybe he knows something I don't. You are noticing attributes and character traits that are good and worth aspiring to. You are noticing attributes that make certain people more successful than others. You are noticing what a hero looks like. And in the process, you are discovering a path made up of desirable personality traits that helps you ascend in social hierarchies. That's Jacob's ladder, by the way. That ladder that is the hierarchy to the good. That's the vision Jacob has of the pathway to God, is that it's a hierarchical structure with the thing that's ultimately good at the pinnacle, by definition, right? The best of all possible goods. And then there are intermediary structures all the way up, and beings inhabiting those structures. And this isn't metaphysical. It's like if you find someone you admire, the reason you admire them is because they're higher up in that heavenly hierarchy, so to speak, than you are. And your whole nervous system tells you that. You're compelled to listen, you're compelled to pay attention by the action of your own unconscious mind.
You know, what's interesting about this point of identifying these heroes or at least role models, you can call them either one. I just thought heroes was a more compelling word to use for the sake of writing it. But what's interesting about it too is how pop culture actually plays a pretty important part of this, because like there's plenty of people who simply don't have these good role models in their lives, and you have to acknowledge that. And so where are they supposed to turn? And it's maybe one of the reasons that it's so important to fight these cultural wars that you and I engage in on a fairly regular basis, that they become a serious part of our politics, which at the same time is necessary, but also deeply, deeply unfortunate. I do think the attack on pop culture from this progressive victimhood left has reached a ceiling. I think there's a serious backlash. You look at movies like Top Gun, the recent one, Top Gun, and maybe like the highest grossing of all time. Absolutely phenomenal movie, really fun to watch. Why? Because it just had all of these classical virtues infused within it, about relationships and about how you treat people and what the consequences are for treating people as such. That these things speak to people in a deeper way. They can't necessarily articulate them, but they understand it when they see it. And there's these sort of radical minorities that are very loud that want that changed. They want something else to be on that hill, but people react against it because it's not true. There's no truth to that.
And something cries out from inside of them then, and that can be appealed to by a storyteller. I saw the same thing in the Marvel Avengers series, is that there is a return to any wide range of classical virtues, certainly brotherhood, a kind of a military ethos, sacrifice, a striving upward, certainly masculine virtues, the combination of the Hulk and Iron Man, for example. There's a monstrous element to the Hulk, but he's a hero in a strange sense, and he's also the revitalizing force for Iron Man when he just about dies, and that's all. The reason those movies were so necessary and so attractive is because they are, in fact, addressing a radical conceptual void in the culture, and it's a void that you're addressing in your book, especially with your appeal, trifold appeal, let's say, to duty, responsibility, and humor at the same time, right? Which is a kind of stoicism in the face of catastrophe. Because this is a big problem in life. Imagine you're aiming for something and then something happens to make it impossible, or you find out that it's the wrong thing because you were aiming in the wrong direction. Well, so then what do you have to rely on to set you right? It's not your aim, obviously, but it might be your capacity to take new aim, and that's bloody well dependent on your character. That's for sure. And so I don't think there is a more fundamental aim than what you should be, and there's no better way of characterizing what you should be than that you should fortify your character.
You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. And that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you, plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at, really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. It's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. The people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. You know, and I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in stir qualinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know. And he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really, it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that. You know, and if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it, and he tried to do what he could, you know, and like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. Her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they were around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't Family Feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's. And they got to know each other, you know. And he died after a while, and she died after a while. And then a few months later, they started going out. And then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up. These men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers. They're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally. And the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. If we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power of all the insane propositions. My audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35. Not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world, and the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary, and it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
It's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. It's like, yes, right, exactly. So what do you do about that? Well, I thought about that for a long time too. It's like, well, you don't get together in a damn mob, because all that does is allow you to be as horrible as you could possibly imagine and suffer from none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. So how about we don't do that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. You know, I read a lot about the terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it. It's so awful. So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You know, you too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way, and lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like, act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together, for Christ's sake, so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could, like, polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then your eyes will be a little more open, then you can shine yourself up a little bit more, and then maybe you could bring your family together instead of having them be the hateful, spiteful, neurotic, infighting batch that So then you fix yourself up a little bit, kind of humbly, because, you know, God, you're a fixer-upper if there ever was one. And then you got to figure out, well, can you figure out how to make peace with your idiot brother? And probably not, because he's just as dumb as you, so how the hell are you going to manage that? And so then maybe you get somewhere that way, and your family's sort of functioning, and you find out, well, that kind of relieved a little bit of suffering, although it reduced the opportunities for spiteful revenge, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. And so then you get your family together a little bit, and you're a little clued in then, at least a bit, because you've done something difficult that's actually difficult. You're a little wiser, and so then maybe you could put a tentative finger out beyond the family and try to change some little thing without wrecking it. It's like, our society is complex, and we teach our students that they could just fix it. It's like, go fix a military helicopter and see how far you get with that. It's like, what are you going to do? You're like a chimp with a wrench. Whack! Oh, look, it's better. It's like, no, it's not better. Things are complicated, and to fix things is really hard. And you have to be like a golden tool to fix things, and you're not. So, and that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, you know, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing, and then you don't have any responsibility, because who the hell cares, and you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be, and you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? And you'll find very rapidly that it isn't the majority of your soul that's pursuing the whole meaning thing, because, well, look what you have to do that. You have to take on the fact that life is suffering. You have to put yourself together in the face of that. Well, that's hard. Christ, it's amazing people can even do it. I'm stunned every day when I go outside, and it isn't a riot with everything burning. Because really, God, you talk to people, it's like, I knew this guy, he'd been in a motorcycle accident, and it really ruined him, and he was like a linesman, you know, working on the power, and he was working with someone who had Parkinson's disease, and they had complementary inadequacies, and so two of them could do the job of one person, and so they're out there fixing power lines in the freezing cold, despite the fact that one was 3/4 wrecked with a motorcycle accident and the other one had Parkinson's. It's like, that's how our civilization works. It's like, there's all these ruined people out there, they've got problems like you can't believe. Off they go to work and do things they don't even like, and look, the lights are on. My God, it's unbelievable. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And we're so ungrateful. College students, the postmodern types, they're so ungrateful. You know, they don't know that they're surrounded by just a bloody miracle. It's a miracle that all this stuff works, that all you crazy chimpanzees that don't know each other can sit in the same room for 2 hours sweltering away without tearing each other apart, because that's what chimps do. So, anyways, so what happened? Well, I made some videos, and I got to the bottom of some things, at least as far as I can tell, so I told you what the bottom is, and then I got this idea about what you might do about it, which isn't my idea. It's not my idea. It's an old idea. It's far older than Christianity. It's old. It's the oldest story of mankind. Get yourself together. Transcend your suffering. See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less. Well, that's the way forward, as far as I can tell, if there is any way forward.
It's funny that philosopher Kierkegaard, you don't usually hear a joke that starts like that, by the way. He wrote 150 years ago, and he was one of the first people who really wrote about anxiety. He was one of the first psychological philosophers. And he regarded himself as rather useless, all things considered. And he wrote a section in one of his books about all the industrialists that were operating in Europe at that time, trying in every possible way
to make life easier and easier and more efficient and productive for everyone, which was definitely happening during the Victorian period, and Europe was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. And he said, someone as useless as him, with an orientation towards being a student who liked to sit and contemplate ideas and talk in cafes and smoke cigars and drink, could never do anything to make anything easier for anyone than everyone was already trying to make it. And so he thought that his task would be to make things more difficult for people, because there would come a time when what people wanted wasn't more ease, but more challenge and more difficulty. And that's really smart, you know, and it's witty and it's true. And one of the things that I've come to understand, I believe, is that, and Dostoevsky knew this too. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in, this is like 1860, a long time ago. He said, you know, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought is pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting, you know. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, you know, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, you know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that, that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, you know, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 in the morning and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, you know, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life. And you're lucky if it won't be decades, you know, it'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it. And for some of you, it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, you know, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day. And, you know, a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And but, you know, God appears to him and says, Get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort. Leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. And then Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, and they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked. They regret the chances they didn't take. And, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. You want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life. In fact, you'll pay for this. You'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit. Not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, And maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart. But, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? That's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? And there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, And it's because to surf, you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment. But without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge. And maybe that's exactly what you want to do. And there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored, nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life, and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. And you kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves, and so it's up to you, and your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, you know, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others, and part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you know, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security.
You're asked to outline the place you'd like to end up, which is your desired future, and also the place that you could end up if you let everything fall apart, is so that your anxiety chases you and your approach systems pull you forward. You're maximally motivated then. And it's important because otherwise you can be afraid of pursuing the things that you want to pursue, right? And that's very common. And so then the fear inhibits you as the promise pulls you forward, but it makes you weak because you're afraid. You want to get your fear behind you, pushing you. And so what you want to be is more afraid of not pursuing your goals than you are of pursuing them. Putting yourself in a challenging mind frame is much easier on you psychophysiologically, because you don't go into the generalized stress response to the same degree. And you're activating your exploratory and seeking systems, which are dopaminergically mediated and that involve positive emotion. So if you can face something voluntarily rather than having it chase you, it's way better for you psychophysiologically. So that's partly why, well, it's worthwhile to go find the dragon in its lair instead of waiting for it to come and eat you. So, and especially when you also add the idea that if you go find the dragon in its lair, you might find it when it's a baby instead of a full-fledged bloody monster that is definitely going to take you down. Don't avoid small problems that you know are there. Face them, because they'll grow into big problems all by themselves. And you can think about, imagine the tax department sends you a notification. You owe them like $300. Well, it's you know, that's annoying. Maybe you don't even want to open the letter. Or maybe if you do, you just put it on the shelf. But that damn thing doesn't just sit there like a piece of paper on the shelf, right? You ignore that for 5 or 6 years, it's going to become attached to all sorts of horrible things. And if you ignore it long enough, you get the idea. It's going to turn into something that is completely unlike the little piece of paper that it's written on. And many problems in life are like that. You'll see that they pop their ugly little head up, and you know, and you might want to turn away. You might not want to think about it, which is the easiest way of turning away, right? You just don't attend to it. You know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, you know, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, you know, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then, so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. Number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. It's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, you know, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want.
What we mean by soul is something like animating spirit. And you might say, well, what's a spirit? And well, that's actually rather easy to answer. So when a child of 4 is playing house, let's say when a child of 4 is playing house, she acts out the role of the mother. But acting out, that's a strange thing, right? Because she doesn't literally duplicate in her actions or her perceptions in the game what she observed her mother literally doing. So, for example, she didn't go into her mother's bedroom when her mother awoke and watched her turn her head in a particular way to awaken and count the number of blinks so that she could mimic that in her play. And, you know, you think that's absurd, but it's not absurd if it's just mimicry. It's not. It's unbelievably sophisticated. So what the girl does is she watches her mother manifest maternal behavior across a vast array of instances, and she integrates that with the image of the mother she's received from all the books she's been read and all the little movies she's watched, the Disney movies and so forth, and she abstracts out the animating principle of the maternal, and then she embodies that in play, and usually with a little boy, and that's practice for what's going to come later. It's unbelievably sophisticated, and she's embodying a spirit, and the spirit there is the abstraction of the central animating principle from multiple embodiments of its manifestation. And if you think children can't do that, well, then you don't know anything about children, because they do that all the time in their pretend play, which is a necessary precursor to healthy psychological development. And so part of what we refer to as the soul is the presence of that spirit, or maybe even the capacity of embodying such spirits. And it's very difficult to know how deep that goes. You know, I had a vision at one point of all the men in my life who've been particularly influential in a benevolent way. You know, and you think, well, just the mere notion of the idea that there could be a benevolent way that would unite the acts of benevolence across a series of men, that's all comprehensible to you. That's,
you take that as a matter of course when you say that there are such things as good men, and you can identify them, right? Something stable about whatever is good across multiple manifestations of incarnation, let's say. And I saw that transform into the Father person of the Trinity as the embodiment of that benevolent spirit. Now, I don't have any idea what that means metaphysically, because who does? But that spirit manifesting itself within is certainly part of what we refer to when we talk about the soul. And you can see that shine through people. I mean, it's part of what gives someone charisma. It's part of what elicits the instinct to imitate in you. You know, and you see that even in simple things. When you see a remarkable athlete do something incredibly athletic to put the soccer ball, the football ball through the net, to score the goal, and everybody leaps to their feet in celebration of that, well, that's a celebration of the divine capacity to hit the target dead on. And it grips you at such a low level, way down inside your soul, that you're compelled to your feet to cheer, and you don't even know what you're doing. But you enjoy it, that's for sure. And that enjoyment is also a sign of the depth and utility of that response. You see this in all the things that people do that are, so-called popular entertainment. It's unbelievably sophisticated. The soul is participating in that in the fullest extent. And, you can say, well, there's no necessary use for the religious terminology. It's like, well, until you come up with a better word, there's plenty of use for it, because it's a very complex and deep phenomena. And to, just cast it into the realm of superstition in some casual manner it's just not helpful. Not in any possible. It's not helpful scientifically. It's not helpful ethically. It's not helpful existentially. Try treating someone for a while as if they don't have a soul. Just really, I mean it. Just, treat them like a deterministic machine, if that's your belief. Really act it out. You'll be like the most hated person in town in about 15 minutes. Well, I mean, what do you make of practical evidence like that? I mean, you interact with people as if they're free souls capable of choosing between good and evil. That's what you do all the time. And maybe you can addle yourself out of that by some ridiculous rationalist ideology, but that just means you're kind of a gabbling fool, and it's just going to make you trip over things you don't even notice in all of your social interactions. I don't care how you think philosophically or ideologically, you bloody well know that what I just said is true. So, and that's true even when you're interacting with an infant or a small child. It's true when you're dealing with someone who's elderly and virtually incapacitated in every way. You still see that divine spark, for lack of a better term, and we do lack a better term, by the way. You see that everywhere if your eyes are open and if you're willing to see it, and to the degree that you're responsive to that, then your actions are guided by love and your words are guided by truth.
It took me a long time to understand what sacrifice meant, because on the surface of it, especially the way it's acted out, like burnt offerings and that sort of thing, it just seems like, well, it seems so archaic and distant from us that it's not really comprehensible. But partly from reading Jean Piaget, and Nietzsche for that matter, I started to understand that people often acted out conceptions before they understood what they meant. And we act out a lot of things we don't understand because we're much more complex than we can represent. So we're always acting out things we don't understand. But so there's this idea in Cain and Abel that you have to make sacrifices in order to stay on the good side of God. And so I thought about that practically, say, not so much metaphysically, but practically, and realized that that was equivalent to the discovery of time, of the future, because we do act, and this is a peculiar discovery of human beings, and maybe a consequence of our expanded intelligence, is that we're actually aware of the future, and we actually treat the future as if it's something that you can bargain with. Now, partly it's because the future is other people, and they remember your reputation, they remember your past actions, and if you do someone a favor, then that favor is in some sense stored up in the future. So you could think about the future as a place of judgment about your moral actions. And it's not that far from that to imagining a God who's keeping track of that, or who even is that. But in any case, the idea of sacrifice emerges in the story of Cain and Abel. And
Cain and Abel both make sacrifices to God in order to stay on his good side, let's say. And what a sacrifice means is that you give up something of value in the present so that you can improve the future. And that's no different from what we call discipline. It's exactly the same thing. It's just the concretely acted out version of that. And so, the idea basically was that, well, God was in the transcendent heavens. And the first question would be, well, why is that? And it's like, well, if you go out on a really dark night and look up at the sky, you have a sense of what's beyond you, what's transcendent, what's infinite. And so to associate that with the highest of values is a reasonable association, right, from an emotional point of view. So it's not particularly primitive. It's a smart metaphor, or it's a smart intuition that and it's above you. And we tend to think of when you're moving towards an ideal that you're moving up, that you're moving above, you're moving to the mountaintop, right? You're going up, not down. And so it all sits within that same framework. And it's partly because when you go up, like on a mountain, you can see for long distances, right? So all those things are tangled together. So anyways, so the idea is that you have to give up something of value now so that you make the future better. And sometimes it's even something you love now, and that's a good example too, because often the things that stop us from moving forward are our attachments to things that we should no longer be attached to, right? And in fact, you can almost make that definitional. If you're not moving forward in your life, there's a high probability that you have some idea or some mode of action or some habit that you're so in love with that you won't let go of it. So, all right, so Cain and Abel make sacrifices, and there's kind of a hint in the story that it's just a hint that Cain's sacrifices are sort of second rate. But in any case, it's ambivalent, hey? But Abel, he just does wonderfully well, and everything works out for him. And everyone knows people like that, And so God accepts his sacrifices, but for some reason he rejects Cain's. And maybe it's the arbitrariness of God, or maybe it's because Cain's heart isn't in the right place when he's making his sacrifices, which is more likely. And so Cain goes and has a chat with God, and he says, basically what he says is something like, how in the world can you possibly justify this universe that you created? You look at me and I'm breaking myself in half trying to adapt and to make things right, and it's not working. And then there's this Abel character, and things come easy to him, and everything is flourishing for him, and so, like, what the hell? And if you don't understand that question, then you're not thinking, because it's very, very frequently the case when a serious catastrophe besets you in life that you essentially ask exactly that question. What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of the world? How come there's suffering? And it's easy to become resentful and vengeful as a consequence of that. And so you got to think about what state of mind having your sacrifices rejected puts you in, especially when you see someone who's successful, because that's where the jealousy and resentment starts to fester is probably the right word. And so God says to Cain exactly what he doesn't want to hear, which is, well, yeah, okay, but you have made lots of mistakes in your life. So he basically says sin is at your door like a predatory and sexually aroused animal, and you've invited it into your house to have its way with you and produced something creative as a consequence. So he's used a sexual metaphor, and so that you've willingly gone down the negative path. And you've allowed that to enter into you and to operate in a creative manner. And you've spun off all these terrible thoughts and this justification for not acting properly. And that's why things aren't going well for you. And so don't lay that at my feet, which is the most brutal possible message he could have got. And so then he leaves the presence of God, let's say, and it says in the story that his countenance fell, which meant he was basically enraged. And so what does he do? He goes out and kills Abel. And then that's a very fascinating idea, because Abel is his ideal, so he kills his ideal. And when you kill your ideal, you're lost. And then he does that to take revenge on Abel, but also to take revenge on God, which I think is extremely interesting and a deep, deep idea. Like these kids who shoot up high schools, for example, you cannot understand what they're doing unless you understand the story of Cain and Abel. You cannot understand what possesses them until you can understand that someone, even someone who doesn't believe, it doesn't matter, it's the psychological state of mind that matters, is they're out for revenge on being itself. And that's why they produce as much mayhem as possible in the shortest period of time. That's why they sacrifice innocent people, because it's much more vengeful and demonstrative to kill innocent people than to kill guilty people, right? Because it's a worse sin, so to speak. And then they kill themselves. And they kill themselves as a final demonstration of their belief in nihilism and the horror of existence. Because you might say, well, why don't they just kill themselves first and save everyone the trouble? You know, and there's narcissism in that too, because they know their names are going to be splashed across the page. That's their notoriety instead of their accomplishment. And of course, the media is unbelievably complicit in that. So when you're talking about motivation for evil, then you have to understand what it is that's driving it. And it is a deep resentment about the structure of being, for being saturated with suffering, but also for rejecting your sacrifices. And that, you know, that produces the bitterness of failure. And I'll stop with this. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament is that, and the Jews in the Old Testament, is that they don't take the path of Cain. Every time they're walloped by God, which is like fairly frequently, they say, we must have done something wrong and we have to set ourselves right. And that's an unbelievably heroic attitude, because that's the alternative to cursing fate. It's like you take the responsibility for failure onto yourself.
My question is, what does this listening posture look like over time? And with your knowledge of personal psychology, I think we can all say we've somewhere encountered one of those relationships where one person does all the work and the other person can't engage in this, even if they have been listened to over and over and over again. But at our society level, if that does happen, now let's try it. I totally agree with you. Let's listen. If we wind up in this, sometimes it's always listening and it never turns into listening back.
Right.
What's that look like over time?
You do test for reciprocity. Mm-hmm. So children, for example, when children are investigating potential play partners on the playground, they'll come up to a child. Let's assume a child of roughly the same age, because that would be the most common situation. Maybe we're talking about kids who are 4 or 5 years old. And they'll throw out a play gesture that's rather simple, so maybe that a 2-year-old could manage. And then if the person manages a proper response, then they throw out a little more sophisticated gesture. And if the person responds appropriately, then they ratchet up to just above their developmental level. And then they play like mad at that level, and that'll make them friends. And so partly what they're testing for there continually is whether there's something approximating reciprocal altruism, right? It's tit for tat in the positive sense. And I would say that, well, we know there's actually a literature on this, which is quite interesting. This is also something very practical to know, and I'll get to another practicality here. So there have been psychologists who've done empirical investigations into what predicts the longevity of a relationship. And so here's one experiment that was conducted multiple times, and I believe this is very reliable data. So imagine you have the two partners in a marriage, each rate the number of encounters they have with their other partner a day, and it's kind of an arbitrary and subjective measure, but it doesn't matter. You might say, well, I talked to my wife 8 times today. We had 8 different interactions. And then you'd say, well, did you rate those for whether they're positive or negative? And then you can calculate a ratio of positive to negative. And then you can use the ratio to predict the longevity of the relationship. And the data show that if the relationship interactions fall below 5 positive to 1 negative, then the relationship deteriorates and is generally doomed. And so 5 to 1, that's a preponderance of positive interactions, but we're wired so that negative interactions hurt us more than positive interactions help us if they are of the same magnitude. So for example, people will work harder to avoid a loss of $5 than they will to attain a gain of $5. And you might say, well, why is that? And the answer is, you can be absolutely dead, but there's only so happy you can be. And so it's better to err on the side of conservatism in the domain of negative emotion. And so, but interestingly enough, if the interactions rise so that they exceed 11 positive to 1 negative, the relationship also deteriorates. And so what that suggests is that there's it's sort of like smiles with teeth, right? You want a fair bit of positive emotion and reflection from your partner, but you don't want them to be a naive, dependent pushover who's afraid to stand up for themselves. And so you want to, because you're a nasty, horrible human being, and now and then you poke your partner just to see if there's anything there, because that's what you're like. And if you find out there isn't, you'll run roughshod over them, and you think you won't, but you will, especially if they're very good at implicitly encouraging that, which dependent people sometimes are. So you do assess for reciprocity, and the basic rule is you want approximately equal reciprocity in relationships that you want to maintain. Now, maybe, you have enough additional resource to be the giver more often than receiver in some relationships, but I don't even think that really works that well with children. You obviously have to take care of them, but it's not like they don't deliver the goods to you if you have a good relationship with them. And you want to some degree, to enforce that reciprocity. Now, you might say, well, what happens in relationships where that's impossible? And, well, I give you a practical piece of a suggestion on that front. And this is another thing you can do in your own household. This is so useful, man. If you get good at doing this, your life will get so much better. You can't believe it. Is watch the people around you, and whenever they do anything that you would like to see repeated on a regular basis, tell them exactly what they did in detail, with, be positive about it, obviously, and just indicate that you noticed. And because I saw this when I was grading student essays, and so I taught this seminar for a long time, and I was trying to teach kids how to write. They were in their 4th year of university in the honors psych program. You'd think they'd bloody well already know how to write, but they didn't. And so I'd have them write a 4-page essay on a given topic, and then they had to rewrite that to a 6-page essay, and then they had to rewrite that to an 8-page essay. And the first essay I graded, it was only 5% of their grade, and I told them, I'm going to cut you into ribbons, but it doesn't matter because it's 5% of your grade, and so they could tolerate that. And generally, by the 3rd essay, they had written the best thing they'd ever written in their life, and they learned so fast it was unbelievable. But one of the things I noticed was that they did a little testing with the first essay. They'd hand in something. It was just like, God, formulaic, boring. They weren't in it at all, There was nothing of the person in there. There was no thought. There was just the kind of psychobabble that they'd learned, especially if they were in faculties of education. And it was dry and dull, and everything about it was wrong. And so those are hard to grade, right? It's like, what's wrong with my essay? Well, the words aren't right. The phrases, they're not so good. They're not organized well into sentences. The sentences aren't sequenced well in the paragraphs. The paragraphs don't make a coherent argument, and the entire thing is empty. But other than that, no problem. It was often easier just to rewrite those essays than to grade them. So in any case, though, one of the things I did learn was that even in an essay like that, there was usually like 1 sentence or 2 sentences buried on like page 3 that was an actual thought and reasonably clearly stated and somewhat gripping, It was like the person popped out from all the background rubbish and said, well, what about this? And if you saw that and checked it and said, hey, you hit the mark right there, the next essay would be like 2/3 that. And that was really fun to see. And then maybe by the 3rd essay, maybe it was all like that. And then they were really thrilled. It's like, wow, I wrote this, and it was sort of the culmination. Well, it was a 4th-year seminar. It was the culmination of their career as a psychology undergraduate. So that was great fun. But you can do that in your own household. If the envious part of you isn't jealous of the revelation of the goodness of the person. And so here's the opposite tack, if you want to do this. So imagine that you're a man who's managed to attract a mate, and he believes he's punched above his weight. So this woman is more attractive, let's say, more vivacious, more desirable than he deserves. So that's going to grate on his soul a fair bit, right? Partly because her shining casts a dim light on his lack of utility, let's say. And so you can imagine someone like that being prone to jealousy for obvious reasons. And so the best tack to manage in a situation like that, if you're that man, is to wait till your wife dresses herself up in a particularly attractive manner and then either fail to notice by occupying yourself with something trivial while she's attempting to gain your attention, or by criticizing her directly for what she's just managed to do. And if you do that 50 times, let's say, you can be sure that she'll never reveal her attractiveness to anyone else for the rest of her life, including you, and you'll get exactly what you deserved. So that's the opposite of watching people carefully. Now, I learned this in part from Skinner, B.F. Skinner, the famous animal behaviorist, because he used all sorts of reinforcement contingencies to shape animal behavior. And Skinner was unbelievably good at this. He trained pigeons in World War II to guide missiles by pecking at photographs. So they could map the photographs onto the missile trajectory, viewing the territory underneath, and peck accurately enough to guide the missile to its destination. That was discontinued as the technology for guided missiles developed, but Skinner could do that. And, you know, we think pigeons, well, they're not that bright. It's like, they're smarter than you think, pigeons. That's why they can live in cities. That's not easy for a bird to pull off, you know. It's not their natural habitat. And so, but Skinner, although he would use punishment, technically speaking, which is the application of a certain amount of pain, or threat, which is the use of anxiety, but what he believed was most effective was reward. But it required a tremendous amount of attention. So, for example, if Skinner was trying to train a rat to climb up a little ladder and then across the ladder and then maybe do a pirouette and come down, which he could do with no problem, he'd wait, he'd just watch the rat, and then when it got close to the ladder, he'd give it a food pellet. Now, his rats were starved, by the way, down to 3/4 of their normal body weight, so they were pretty eager to work for food. It's not something you necessarily saw in the methodology section of the papers, but, and that's not a critique of Skinner, it's just an indication of how simplification takes place in laboratory experiments. But in any case, he'd wait for the rat to get near the ladder and give it a food pellet. And soon the rat would be hanging around the ladder quite a lot. And then now and then, just more or less randomly, the rat would put a paw up on the ladder. Food pellet. Well, then the rat would hang around the bottom of the ladder with paw up. Well, if he did that continually through observation, he could get the rat to do pretty much anything that you could imagine a rat to do, and then maybe some things you couldn't imagine. And this isn't a manipulative technique, by the way, although it can be used that way. It's not effective unless you do it with a certain degree of wisdom. You want to think, well, what do you want in your house? How about peace, tranquility, happiness, and humor? Something like that. It's not a bad first pass approximation. And you got to get that in your head. It's like, do you want that, or do you want the delights of endless martyrdom? Because you have to make a choice, and you might think, I wouldn't pick martyrdom. It's like, really? Really? You wouldn't, eh? You'd pick peace and happiness and humor, and so everywhere you go, that's all you're ever surrounded with. It's like highly improbable. So don't be so sure you're aiming up. But if you can orient yourself in that direction, and carefully, and knowing full well what the hellish alternative is, because you need to know that, then you can watch and see, well, when is this manifesting itself in the people around me? And then you can tell them in detail, I noticed today we're having a discussion at dinner, you know, and you made a spectacularly witty remark right at the right time, and it was provocative but not annoying, and so good work. And then the kid thinks, oh my God, he noticed. And then he's like twice as funny the next day, and maybe not in some unbearable manner. And that really works. It really works. But like I said, you have to quell the envy that would otherwise beset you, and you have to want to aim up, and then you have to not be jealous of the other person's goodness, and you have to be extremely attentive. But man, as a transformation technique, even in extraordinarily difficult relationships, which goes back to your point, there isn't anything I know of that's more effective. And I've been working with moderate Democrats in the United States recently, and with a number of Republicans, and suggesting that to the Democrats that when the Republicans do something that isn't absolutely malevolent and stupid, in your opinion, you might want to just say something. Like, that's not as bad as it could have been, you know, something at least. And the same for the Republicans in relationship to the Democrats, and that because it's also one of the ways that you can reduce the tit-for-tat proclivity, right? you want to give the devil his due, especially when you're not actually talking to the devil, but just the person who's sitting across you, let's say in the house. It's an unbelievable, and people, that's another issue. I mean, if you want people to appreciate having you around, learning how to listen, that is a skill that is absolutely unbeatable. And this technique of summarizing to their satisfaction, that works like a charm. And it's not, you might be a little awkward when you first try it and might feel a little manipulative because you're not that good at it. But if you get expert at it, and you have the greatest conversations with everyone. I had people in my clinical practice who were extraordinarily impaired intellectually and suffering from all sorts of assorted pathologies in addition to that. And if I was listening to them properly, they were as fascinating as anybody I had on the, say, more able and competent end of the spectrum. And you learn so much because there is nothing that people won't tell you if you listen. It is absolutely amazing what people will tell you. And so quickly, they'll reveal things they didn't even know about themselves. And they need to know those things often. They've been hidden for years. It's so rewarding. And then this use of attentive reward, that's also, it's fun in a game-like sense once you learn to play it, because you're watching. You think, I'll just wait. This person's going to do something good. Sooner or later, it's like, pat, good work. And people are so thrilled that little manifestation of goodness in their heart that managed to sneak out past their cynicism and boredom was recognized. They're so, it restores their faith in what's good inside them. It really does. It's unbelievably powerful. And so that can work if you're embroiled in a difficult relationship, and you can't escape easily, or maybe you can't escape on moral grounds. That listening, that helps a lot. You might have to listen a lot, but that use of judicious reward, man, that's a powerful technique.
Is there room for jealousy and insecurity in a relationship? Is there a healthy amount of jealousy that people should have in a relationship? Or does jealousy and insecurity only cause more suffering and pain in a relationship?
Well, I think there's a reasonable amount of proprietary interest, let's say. I mean, in a classic monogamous relationship, a marriage, there's sexual fidelity as a crucial element of that. And maybe you'll make an arrangement that differs from that, but it's not easy to chart uncharted territory like that. I mean, if you want to have an adventure like that with a partner, a monogamous adventure that also includes sexual exploration, well, maybe you can pull it off, but I doubt it. It's really complicated.
Yeah. Let's say you're not having sexual exploration with other people and you're telling each other the truth and you're being honest. Is there room to be jealous or insecure in that relationship? Or does jealousy typically cause more harm than it does, spice and good, I guess?
I think jealousy probably causes more trouble than good, but that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the proprietary interest. Mm-hmm. Should you care if your partner pays undue attention to someone of the opposite sex they find attractive? Well, probably you should care. You might even say something about it. They might even be happy about that, right? Because it indicates that you noticed and that it matters to you. Now, I think it shades into jealousy when it's harmless interactions. It's interactions that would be regarded as harmless by a third-party observer, let's say. Mm-hmm. I know that's a very difficult line to draw, that are being magnified as a consequence of insecurity on the part of the observer. Or there's envy, where your partner is attracting attention, status, success, any of those things, and you're jealous of that. That's not helpful. You should be pleased. The optimal situation is for you to be pleased when your partner is successful. I don't think competitive couples, I don't think competition between people who are in a monogamous relationship is useful, particularly. It's not zero-sum competition.
Yeah.
I mean, you can compete in a game-like sense,
Right.
You know,
Fun,
like
fun, playful competition, but not. I'm
yeah,
better
but
than you in
not
life.
not existential competition. You're on the same team. That's the point.
Right.
You know, and if one of you is feeling left behind for one reason or another, it's time to throw that out on the table and say, look, I'm playing second fiddle here far too often. What can we do about that? Well, it looks like you need it, and like I've got an adventure, it looks like you need one too. Well, how can we rearrange the situation so I have my adventure? And then it's up to that person too to figure out what obstacles they might be putting up in their own pathway,
Yeah.
right? That's stopping them. And then they have, you know, they're angry at you for getting in the way, but it's actually a consequence of them using you as a convenient excuse for not doing something difficult. Those things all have to be sorted through. It's very hard.
Yeah.
Like, these conversations are extremely difficult. It's no wonder people avoid them. I also think people are not taught to negotiate
Oh man.
at all. And that's a real shame. First of all, you figure out what you want. This is what I want. Then you tell the person, then you strategize with them so that you can get what you want and they can get what they want, and you both know what that is, and away you go together. And that usually comes out, it's usually obscured and hidden, and comes out awkwardly and difficulty, and with difficulty if it comes out at all. And people fool themselves into thinking that it's okay what they're doing. I'm sacrificing myself for the children, and that's okay. I'm sacrificing myself for my husband's career, and that's okay. I'm working at a job I can't stand because I need to support my wife and children, and that's okay. I mean, sometimes that is okay, but it has to be out clear in the open, talked about, negotiated, discussed. You know, I think you can be a slave or a tyrant, or you can negotiate. Those are your options.
Mm-hmm.
And we default to slavery and tyranny because that doesn't require any cognitive effort. And then we pretend that everything's all right. And then it blows up in our faces and we end up divorced.
Right. So we got to learn how to negotiate. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and then you have to notice that there are things that you want, right? And you have to tell yourself what those are. And then you have to let the other person know. And then they can deprive you of them because they actually know who you are. And so that's a big risk. But if you do lay it out and negotiate it, then you have two people working in the same direction, and they each bring their different viewpoints to bear on the problem. And sometimes that'll save you, you know, that additional cognitive complexity you have because there's two of you instead of one. It can make you much more effective.
What happens when we feel like our partner is depriving us of what we want? If it's not, you know, infidelity or something of the likes of being with other people, but something else that we want in our life, a goal.
Well, sexually, that happens all the time.
Right.
Because people, generally speaking, men would like to have sex more frequently than women. So that's a sticking point in many relationships. But forget that for the moment. We might just as well say that the probability that one partner and the other partner are going to have exactly the same level of sexual interest, say with regards to frequency, is quite low. So there's going to be friction there. So what do? Well, you negotiate about it. It's like, well, I'd like to have sex 15 times a week. Well, I'd like to have sex once a week.
Right.
Okay, well, you know, the logical meeting point there would be in the middle. But then that has to be planned out. And you also have to say exactly what you mean. Well, exactly what do you mean by sex? Because there's all sorts of variations of sex, ranging from just intimate closeness to full-fledged sexual activity of various sorts. And the various sorts matter too. And these are painful discussions often. It's very funny in some sense that people will do and desire things that they won't talk about, right? They'll engage in the act, but they won't engage in the negotiation. And they won't admit what they want.
Why is it so hard for us to admit what we want?
We're ashamed of it. That's easy with sex. Sex and shame regulates sex. you know, people say, well, you shouldn't be ashamed of sex. It's like, well, really? Really? No, that's a stupid theory. We arrest people who expose themselves in public. Why? Well, because we don't want people masturbating in public. We assume they should be ashamed enough not to do that. Shame regulates sexual behavior. So we're embarrassed about our desires. And, you know, naively, you'd think, well, you can just shed that. Well, first of all, no, you can't. And second of all, it isn't obvious at all that you should. What you might be able to do is to determine how to play out your sexual life in the confines of your relationship in a manner that neither of you do find shameful. But that's just think how hard that is. Like, you know, you think, well, that's what I want. It's like, but then you think about how unlikely that is and how difficult it would be to attain it. You know, you could say that if that ever happens to you in your life once, you're lucky, you know, that it's perfect. Now, I think that's pessimistic because I believe that solutions to that problem can be negotiated, but it's not. It's what everyone wants, but it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to bring about. You know, so let's say you want the ideal romantic evening. Well, okay, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to put yourself in reasonable physical shape? So you're attractive? Are you going to make a playlist and put some time into it? Are you going to buy some candles? Are you going to buy something nice to wear? Are you going to wear it? Are you going to dare to wear it? That might be true for you and for your partner. Are they going to dare to wear it? Are you going to be smart enough if they do wear it to respond in a way that makes them feel confident and increases the probability that they'll do it again? Are you going to do whatever is necessary to make yourself physically attractive in that moment? Are you going to have the kids put away? Have you got the day-to-day aggravations with each other that are dragging you down and making you resentful under control so that you actually do want to give your partner some pleasure? Like, these things are very hard, but they're not impossible, and they're worth it. But it's not surprising that people don't do it. And then the next, well, then there's the shame part too, as well. Okay, just exactly what is permissible or desirable, and when are your kinks counterproductive? Exactly. You know, we certainly can't have that discussion as a culture. You know, on the one hand, we think, we're so split on this. On the one hand, we think any sexual misbehavior should be subject to the harshest of punishments, and everything goes and is acceptable. It's like, well, good luck having both of those ideas.
Right.
And it's so interesting to me to watch this. You know, there's just outrage, constant outrage about sexual misbehavior. And fair enough. Like, that doesn't surprise me.
When you mean sexual misbehavior, you mean someone cheating or someone having an affair, or what sexual misbehavior?
Yes, or unwanted sexual attention or sexual harassment. And I'm not saying these things don't happen or that they're not nefarious and awful. Obviously they are. It's no wonder that happens. But at the same time, we also are obsessed with the notion that any sexual interest of any sort whatsoever, with the possible exception of sexual interest in children, is absolutely laudable. Well, sorry, you can't have both of those things.
Right, right.
So, and because we want both of them, insist upon both of them, then we can't even have a discussion. We can't have a discussion about pornography. It doesn't look to me like pornography is really a very good idea. I don't think it's helping anyone. Now, you know, there might be codicils to that, freedom of expression, some potential educational utility, the pleasure that's a consequence of sexual utilization of pornographic material. But I would still say, seeing all that it's not a net social good. It doesn't do the people who produce it or who consume it any good. And I don't believe that anyone feels like a better human being after utilizing pornography for sexual gratification. Now, you might say, well, that's because they've been shamed about sex since they're born, and, you know, and that's a consequence of our crooked culture. And, you know, in a utopian world, we wouldn't have that shame. And yeah, no, it's way more complicated than that. And I read something in one of the YouTube comments in my video the other day. I was talking to Abigail Schreier about the apparent fact that today's teenagers are having much less sex. One person commented that there's the shame that men feel when sex is a spectator sport rather than a participatory act. And then you think, well, you know, the mere fact that you're watching two other people, one of whom isn't you, having sex instead of having sex, really implies something either about your, it implies something about your desirability. It's pretty hard to shake that, isn't it? Or your courage. Why is it that you're sitting there alone at night with your laptop on your lap? What the hell's wrong with you? Well, nothing. It's just we should dispense with sexual shame. It's like, no, probably not. That's probably not the answer.
I worked with this crazy psychologist. He used to put jokes on his multiple choice tests. He was a really eccentric guy, but I really liked his courses. He taught a course on creativity, and he was also a prison psychologist. And he was an eccentric guy, and he, for some reason, liked me, and maybe because I was eccentric too. And he invited me to go out to the Edmonton maximum security prison with him a couple of times, which I did. And that was a very interesting experience because I was trying to figure out what role each individual's behavior bore to the pathology of the group. It was something like that. And I went out there and I met a little guy, smaller than me. I was a little bigger by then. And he was a pretty innocuous guy. And what had happened was I was out in this gymnasium. It looks like a high school, a prison, which is really quite telling in my estimation. And there were all these like monsters in there, weightlifting, and like they were monsters. I remember one guy who was tattooed everywhere, and he had like a huge scar running down the middle of his chest. It looked like someone had hit him with an axe, and you know, and I was in there, and I had this weird cape that I used to wear that I bought in Portugal, and some boots that went along with it. And yeah, it was like an 1890s Sherlock Holmes cape, and it was really like it was from the 1890s because this little village was up on a hill. It was a walled city on a hill, and they sold these things, and I don't think they'd changed the style since 1890, and so I thought they were really cool, and so I was wearing that, which wasn't perhaps the most conservative garb to don if you're going to go to a maximum security prison. So anyways, I was in the gymnasium, and the psychologist left. And God only knows, I mean, that's what he was like. And all these guys came around me, you know, and they were offering to trade their prison clothes for my cape. And it was, it was like I was being made an offer I couldn't refuse, you know, and so I didn't really know what to do. And then this little guy said something like that the psychologist sent me to come and take you away or something like that. And so I thought, well, better this little guy than all these monsters. So we went outside the gym through some doors, like school doors. We went outside the gym into the exercise yard, I guess, and we were wandering along, and he was talking to me, and he seemed like a kind of an innocuous guy. And then the psychologist showed up at the door and motioned us back, okay? And so, which was kind of a relief. And so I went into his office, and he said, you know that guy that you walked out in the yard with? And I said, yeah. He said, he took two cops one night, and he had them kneel down, and while they were begging for their lives, he shot them both in the back of the head. And I thought, see, the thing that was so interesting was that he was so innocuous, right? Because what you'd hope is that someone like that would be very much unlike you, let's say, and certainly wouldn't be like someone innocuous that you'd met. What you'd want is that the guy would be like, you know, half werewolf and half vampire, so you could just tell right away that he was a cold-blooded killer. But no, he was this sort of ineffectual little guy who was certainly not ineffectual if you gave him a revolver and the upper hand. And so that made me think a lot about the relationship between being innocuous and being dangerous. And then another thing happened. I met another guy out there, and then a week or two later I heard that he and a friend of his had held another guy down and pulverized his left leg with a lead pipe, like just pulverized it. And the reason for that was that they thought that he was a snitch, and maybe he was. And that time I did something different. Instead of being shocked and horrified by that, although I certainly was, I thought, how in the world could you do that? Because I didn't think I could do that. Eh? I didn't think that, I thought that there was a qualitative distinction between me and those people. And so I spent about 2 weeks trying to see if I could figure out under what conditions I could do that. Like what kind of psychological transformation I would have to undergo to be able to do that. And so that was a meditative exercise, let's say. And it only took about 10 days for me to realize that not only could I do that, that it would be a hell of a lot easier than I thought it would be. And that's sort of where that wall between me and what Jung described as the shadow started to fall apart. And that also was very useful because I started to treat myself as a somewhat different entity because I hadn't been aware up to that point, you know, because I thought I was a good guy. And there's no reason for me to think that, because you're not a good guy unless you've really made a bloody effort to be a good guy. You're just not. It's not easy. And so you're probably a moderately bad guy. And that's a long ways from being an absolutely horrible guy, but it's also a long ways from being a good guy. And so, but I had a little more respect for myself after that, because I also understood that there was a monstrous element to the human psyche that you needed to respect. And that was part of you, that you should regard yourself in some sense as a loaded weapon. It's very useful around children to regard yourself as a loaded weapon, because around children you are a loaded weapon. And the terrible experiences that many children have with their parents are testament to that. And I would say, you don't just have to face the reality of unjust suffering and death in your life. You have to face the reality of hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, do you believe in Nazi Germany? You know, do you believe in Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China or Cambodia? That's hell. And you can assess that more deeply. You could say, well, that's not even hell. That's not as precise a formulation of hell as you might be able to conceptualize. Hell is actually participation in the process that led to the establishment of those countries. And that's something that human beings do. And the fact that we do that is something we have to face. And maybe that's even worse than death. And I think you can make a case for that. I really do. I think there are things in life that are worse than death. There are things in life that are worse than unjust suffering and death. And the things that lead to hell are worse. And you might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you do, as a matter of fact, because you're going to face those things too. And you're going to face that when you face your own malevolence, which you will, and you're going to face that when you face the malevolence of others, including the mob. And some of that's just death and tragedy, and some of it is something far darker and deeper than that. And so, yeah, you face that. And so that's kind of interesting. And then you might think, well, how should you face that? And that's where Tammy's story is relevant. It's like, well, so she went and swam with the sharks. And I wasn't very happy about that, because our life has been adventurous enough. I thought, do you really need to go swim with the sharks? And the answer seemed to be, well, that would be an adventure. And you know, I don't interfere with her when she's having an adventure. She's going to go have an adventure. It's far be it for me to interfere. And then she told me, you know, that you had to look the shark in the eye, or it would think you're prey. Think, well, what do you have to look in the eye so you're not prey? And you know, human beings have been trying to figure that out for a long time, because we're strange animals, because we're predators, but we're also prey. And so I guess at any moment you're sort of deciding, well, are you a predator? Are you the thing that's on top, or are you prey? And you're prey if you turn tail and run. And there's a psychological truth there, like a deep psychological truth. And it seems to be something like, if you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So the
much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor, which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. Are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure? Regardless of its scope, and the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal, because it's realistic. It's not naive at all. It says, look, man, trouble's coming your way, and it's real. And yet it's possible that you could confront that and still do good in the deepest sense. It's like, well, that's quite something. It would be really quite something if that's true. And one of the preconditions of that would be faith, I suppose. And in some sense, that's what Tammy was manifesting when she went down and swam with the sharks. Faith that if she looked the bloody predator in the eye, that would solve the problem. And then you think too, well, could it be any other way? It's like, well, we have all these problems in our lives, and we could think there's two possible ways of approaching those problems. One would be we just ignore them in the hopes they would what? Go away? Well, no one thinks that's, no one who isn't a child thinks that, and very few children. Nobody believes that. We know perfectly well that if you got to face something, man, you better face it. And if you're going to face it, that's probably the best pathway forward. And then you might think, well, what does that mean ultimately? And it might mean something like, face it, as deeply as you possibly can and as voluntarily as you possibly can. And there's an element of faith in that, because you have to put yourself on the line. But you're kind of stuck with that anyways. That's the rub.
If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so,
wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling
of the... many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people, or is that ultimately the same thing? It. Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. You know. And it's one of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering, and it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well. And so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better.
It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze me. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit. And so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that. And then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. They use power to exploit those who are weak. That explains all economic relationships. You can apply the same lens to history. History is nothing but the power struggle between different claims to power. That is absolutely what people are being taught in our institutes of higher education. And it's unlikely that there's a doctrine that's more corrosive in relationship to the actual spirit upon which your country and the free West in general was founded. Those are antithetical stories. Well, what's the alternative story? Well, let's lay some out. Here's another story. Do what you want will be the
totality of the law. That's a somewhat mangled quotation from Aleister Crowley, who was a Satanist in the late part of the 1800s. He was like a disciple of the Marquis de Sade. He was one of these people who believed, as you can believe rationally, that why the hell shouldn't I do just exactly what I want whenever I want to whoever I want, regardless of, well, let's say the cost to them. What's the rational argument against that? What if I have power and I won't get caught, for example? If I just get away with what? The untrammeled expression of my most primordial desires. Why not let that be the story? One whim after another. That's the hedonistic story. It's a cacophony, that story, because as you know from your own experience, if you give yourself over to your immediate wants, you're just one appetite after another, right? There's no real coherence there. You basically have the same psychological status as a very badly behaved 2-year-old. Well, 2-year-olds are like that. They don't have a integrated, their fundamental pattern of being and personality isn't integrated yet. And so they're more or less at the mercy of their whims. And a hedonist is a worshiper of his own whims, right? And he's a pagan in that sense, because it's just one damn desire after another. And he might say to himself, well, those are my desires. He might identify with those desires. And that's really, what would you say, the cardinal form of identification in the modern world. I identify with what my wants are, particularly sexual wants. That constitutes my identity. And anyone who gets in the way can go directly to hell. And that's a very pathological mode of being. And there's a variety of reasons for it, not least that it's exactly reflective of the same kind of immaturity that makes 2-year-olds entirely self-centered and driven by instinct. Now, you might say, well, what's wrong with that? You know, and 2-year-olds have their delightful element. You know, they're very enthusiastic. They're very spontaneous. They're kind of alive in a fiery way, but they're completely incapable of taking care of themselves, right? And this isn't a hypothesis. You don't see roving bands of thriving 2-year-olds running through the forest organizing themselves. Well, why not? Well, it's because that short-term, self-centered, whim-dominated possession doesn't allow you to exist in the world. You have to mature. And of course, that's what you're trying to do with your kids as a parent, is you're trying to shepherd them through the process of maturation. Well, why? Well, so they have some friends. Because if it's all about them, well, then they don't have any friends. And that goes for all of you too. If it's all about you, good luck with your marriage. If it's all about you, you don't have friends. You might have, if you're a bully in particular, you might have, you know, toadies and thugs who benefit from your use of power, but you don't have friends. If you exploit your customers as a business person repeatedly to redound to your own immediate advantage, you're not going to have customers for very long. Your reputation is going to precede you. You're not going to do well in the world. So what do you do instead? Power is a bad story. It's a corrupt way of looking at the world. It leads to violence. It's generally manifested in service to a narrow kind of hedonism, because why have power unless it's to get exactly what the hell the worst of you wants from moment to moment? If you're not under the sway of some self-centered and relatively malevolent whim, you don't need to use power on other people, because you could just ask them to go along for the journey. And maybe they would. That's what you do when you play instead of when you use force. That's what you do when you invite instead of using force. That's what you do when you establish a vision that other people share instead of being a tyrant. Well, that's what you do if you're mature. That's even what 2-year-olds understand by the time they're 3, when they start engaging in pretend play with a would-be friend. Who's a friend to a 2-year-old? Well, the first thing, or 3-year-old, because 3-year-olds start to become social. Well, the first thing you want to do if you're a 3-year-old is play a game with someone. That's not the same as having your own game, right? If you play a game with someone else, there are some intrinsic rules. Well, what are the rules? Well, how about they get a turn, right? And maybe a generous turn, right? Because if you're going to have a friend and you want the friend to like you, which is kind of like the definition of a friend, and someone who likes you would like to see you again, and that continuity of the desire to see you again and to play together, that's the definition of friendship. It's a sequence of games played with the same person. The game has to be voluntary, it has to be invitational, it has to be reciprocal, right? And so what you're trying to do with your 2-year-old is you're getting them to sacrifice the immediate gratification of their instincts to reciprocity, right? Now you do something that's a bit more sophisticated than that too, because the other thing you do with children and yourself and with people you love, if you're the least bit sensible, is you let them know that they shouldn't conduct themselves in a manner in the immediate present that compromises their future, right? That's what you mean when you tell your child, don't do stupid things. Well, what's a stupid thing, generally speaking? Something interesting and entertaining in the moment that you pay for, right? And that's the same as an impulsive bad habit in adulthood. It's like the definition of a bad habit. A bad habit is something that works now and not so good tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. That implies as well that just as the child establishes a relationship of reciprocity with the friend, by starting to understand the future, they establish a reciprocal relationship with their future self. And that's the same thing. So what maturation is, we all know this, maturation is the ability, let's say, to share and to forego gratification, to delay gratification. What does it mean to delay gratification? It means you don't get what the hell you want right now all the time. You have to conduct yourself in a manner that assures communal stability, let's say, and reciprocity. And in the enjoyable sense, you want to be surrounded by friends and compatriots and people who move you forward and people who wish you well, because that's going to be a lot better for you than the alternative. And you want to do that in a manner that assures the future. The whole higher cortical apparatus that human beings are blessed and cursed with is there to integrate the possessing spirits that might otherwise be impulsive and fractionating, to integrate them into a personality that can act reciprocally in relationship to others and guide itself as a consequence of apprehension of the future. It's a definition of maturity. Now, you kind of know this because as your children mature, as you've matured, the amount of time you can consider expands, right? For the 13-year-old, for a 4-year-old sitting down to take piano lessons, half an hour is an eternity, right? For a 13-year-old, 6 months into the future is forever. By the time you're 50, a year is like a week, right? Well, and there's a loss in that to some degree, but there's a huge gain because as you develop, your capacity to apprehend the consequences of your actions across broader spans of time is much improved, and that reflects cortical maturation. And the same thing happens with regards to your ability to manage yourself socially. What does it mean to manage yourself socially? Well, it means, as I said, that it's not all about you. Your aim can't be the immediate gratification of the whims that possess you. If you're married, if you have a wife or husband, is your wife or husband, how do they stand in relationship to their importance in relationship to you? Well, we could just think about it in a sort of clear-headed manner. Let's say you have a scrap with your wife, you have a fight with your wife, a disagreement, and you win. You win. She's wrong. She's punished for it in whatever way you can manage. What's the problem with that? You're right, she's wrong. Well, let's say you do that 50 times. Well, now you're living with someone you always defeat. And so now you're living with someone who's defeated. And what's the problem with that? Well, they're around. Right, and so maybe that's the problem with attaining a manipulated victory over your marital partner. fine if it's a one-off, but you know, they're there when you wake up in the morning. And so is the consequence of your, what? Self-centered, power-based maneuvering? Right? And maybe you're a victorious tyrant and she's a defeated slave. Well, that's not much of a victory there, buddy. Right? And the same applies to any reciprocal social relationship. You know, if you have any sense, if you think it through, you want to build up the people that are around you. Well, why? Well, because they're around you. And so if you were if you made generous offerings to the social world and you improved the nexus of relationships that you were involved in, why wouldn't that be good for you? Now, you might think, well, there's only so much to go around, and if everyone else wins, I lose. But that's another story, and it's the story of power. And it's a very bad story, and it's not true. Because the truth of the matter is that there's more than enough for everyone to do. And your victory doesn't have to ever come at the cost of someone else's defeat. I shouldn't say ever. I mean, there are times when, you know, people are head to head and the game that's being played isn't fair and it's your victory or your defeat. But those are very pathological and unnecessary circumstances. And it would be better to do everything you can to ever avoid being in a situation like that. Situations like that arise when your relationships have deteriorated radically.
That's that willingness to gaze into the abyss, which is obviously what you were doing when you went to Ukraine. It's like, it's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell. It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest.
That's such an interesting distinction. Voluntary suffering.
Voluntary, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why the central Christian doctrine is pick up your cross and follow me. And I'm speaking not in religious terms saying that. I'm just speaking as a psychologist. It's like one of the things we've learned in the last 100 years is voluntary exposure to that which freezes and terrifies you in measured proportions is curative. The first thing I do as a clinician, if someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, like, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or maybe they're obsessional. Like there's various forms of powerful negative emotion. So they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed? Or do you have a terrible life? Or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career. You're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed. Exactly. You just have a terrible life. what does that look like? You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You are completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical root, a nutritional root. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend. Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So, yes, hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. And sometimes I have lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening, because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes, which was very hard for me, and to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in the sessions, until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say, if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder, because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now, because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them. Just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online, because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues, that's the present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. That's young men who do that, could go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes. They're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable, and it'll give you a little bit of gold. commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because that's, you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way, but aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, you know, it took years, but still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment. I've dealt with lots of people who have anxiety disorders, you know. And one thing about people who have anxiety disorders is they are not mysterious to me. It's no problem for me to understand why people have anxiety disorders, or why they're depressed, or why they have substance use problems. The mystery to me is always why people don't have all of those things at once. Because everybody has a reason to be anxious. In fact, we have the ultimate reason to be anxious because we know that we're vulnerable and we know that we're going to die. And how you cannot be anxious under those circumstances is a great mystery. It's a massive mystery. And the same thing applies with regards to depression. And then the same thing applies to some degree with regards to drug and alcohol abuse. As I said last week, there's plenty of reasons to drown your consciousness in alcohol, that's for sure. We could refer to the aforementioned anxiety and depression, not least. And the sorts of drugs that people are prone to take are chemicals that take the affective edge off the tragedy of life. So back to the issue of fear. Abraham is self-conscious, that's what this commentary says, but the thing is he moves forward despite that. He's self-conscious and he knows the danger, but he moves forward despite that. And that's actually the appropriate response in the face of actual non-naive understanding of what constitutes life. Like if you're naive and you move forward, it's like, well, what the hell do you know? You know, there's no courage in naivety because you don't know what there is to stop you. You don't know what dangers you might apprehend, but to be aware of what it is that your problem is. So to be alert existentially, let's say, or to be fully self-conscious means that you're perfectly aware of your limitations and how you might be hurt. And then to make the decision to move forward into the unknown and the land of the stranger. Anyways, I would say that's one of the secrets to a good life. And I can say that really without fear of contradiction, I would say, because the clinical literature on this is very, very, very clear. What you do with people who are afraid, and to some degree depressed, but certainly anxious, is you lay out what they're anxious about, first of all, in detail. What is it that you're afraid of? What might happen? And then you decompose it into small problems, hypothetically manageable problems, and then you have the person expose themselves to the thing that they're afraid of, and what happens isn't that they get less afraid. That isn't what the clinical literature indicates exactly. What happens instead is they get braver. And that's not the same thing, right? Because if you get less afraid, it's like, well, the world isn't as dangerous as I thought it was, you know, silly me. If you get braver, that's not what happens. What happens is, yeah, the damn world's just as dangerous as I thought, or maybe it's even more dangerous than I thought, but it turns out that there's something in me that responds to taking that on as a voluntary challenge and grows and thrives as a consequence. And there's no doubt about this. Even the psychophysiological findings are quite clear. If you impose a stressor on two groups of people, and on one group the stressor is imposed involuntarily, and on the other group the stressor is picked up voluntarily, the people who pick up the stressor voluntarily use a whole different psychophysiological system to deal with it. They use the system that's associated with approach and challenge, and not the system that's associated with defensive aggression and withdrawal. And the system that is associated with challenge is much more associated with positive emotion and much less associated with negative emotion. It's also much less hard on you because the defensive posturing system, the prey animal system, man, when that thing kicks in, it's all systems are go for you, you know? The pedal's pushed down to the metal and the brakes are on. You're using future resources that you could be storing for future time right now in the present to ready yourself for emergency. So
There's nothing simple or trivial at all about the idea of being called to move forthrightly forward into the strange and the unknown. And there's a real adventure that's associated with that, right? So that's an exciting thing, which is part of the reason why people travel. And then also to see yourself as the sort of creature that can do that, is willing to do that on a habitual basis, is also the right kind of tonic for, I hate this word, for your self-esteem. You know, because the self-esteem has nothing to do with feeling good about yourself. As I already mentioned, there isn't necessarily a reason why a priori you should just feel good about yourself. But if you can view yourself acting in a courageous and forthright manner and encountering the world and trying to improve your lot and taking risks, you know, in a non-naive way, well, then you have something that you can comfort yourself with at night when you're wondering what the whole damn point is of your futile and miserable life. And that's necessary, because it's often the case that you wake up at 4 in the morning, or at least sometimes the case that you wake up at 4 in the morning when things haven't been going that well, and wonder just what the hell the point is of your futile and miserable life. You have to have something real to set against that. It can't be just rationalizations about how, you know, you're a valuable person among others, even though that's true. That's not good enough. You need something that's more realistic to set against that. And observing courage in yourself is definitely one of the things that can help you sleep soundly at night when things are destabilized a little bit around you.